I did think about putting one word on the slide, but I'm a consultant, so you're going to see a lot of words on slides and a lot of matrices as well. So the first thing, and I just want to introduce myself because transformation and university transformation is very difficult, particularly ones involving digital and digital infrastructure and that whole journey of putting in that infrastructure to change the digital mindset and culture. Culture is another thing that I'll speak about as well, which is difficult to do. But first of all, I just wanted to narrow down the scope a little bit and talk about online education and what universities and particularly business schools are doing in online, because I often see business schools as leading the charge to some degree into online education. So we've kind of talked about physical education and the mix of bricks and mortar education and online education, so asynchronous and synchronous. And then now I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in that online education space. And then as you can see, as a true consultant, there is a little bit of matrix here. So you see two axes, and one is learner commitment, and the other axis is subject matter. And so you can see, I'll start in the top right. You can see a lot of universities, they have a lot of generalist type curriculum, and then also you have business schools that focus on general management education, and then also kind of the softer skills are moving down now. And that requires a lot of commitment. So that's at one angle because you're targeting a different segment of the customer. Then as you kind of move left in the middle, you see a lot of the massive online courses or small private online courses, which are the MOOCs and the SPOCs, they call them. So that's kind of in the middle where you have massive courses that are free, or now they're moving into the freemium model, they call it, which is you pay for something because you want to get something out of education. And one of the things that consumers don't have now is that hook to complete. So for example, when we were doing a bit of work with Stanford and Wharton, for instance, there were 300 to 400,000 students that enrolled in a Wharton online course, but only 10% issued certificates in the end, so 30%. So that's the big challenge with the MOOCs courses at the moment. And you can see in this matrix, actually, a lot of the business schools now partnering with the courses. And that's happened a lot in America. And now you're seeing that translate a little bit in Europe and then Asia last. But Asia's taking a different approach, which I might start talking about a little bit later. And then as you can see, as you go down, the other trend, and everyone's on LinkedIn in this room probably, you get a lot of those spams and those ads when you type, what can I learn next, as we've talked about those bite-sized learnings. And you can see LinkedIn Learning as one of those other aspects, which really look to the specific skill sets to continue on in your lifelong learning education. And so the question is, what's happening in this landscape? And we see a lot of convergence within this picture itself. So for example, business schools and unis are playing in each of those areas, and to do it, they're partnering with each other. So we've talked about a lot of these different trends today, and I've kind of summarized it in kind of what's happening from a provider angle, because we've talked about a lot about is learning effective and the other angle from the consumer and the participant and the student. But the left-hand side talks about what's happening in the general market. So if we look at consumers from a little bit of a different lens and a bit of a corporate lens, you can see a movement from business to consumer to business, because the business kind of user in that lifelong learning, that professional, requires a little bit of a learning and way of learning that's a little bit from a generalist individual in terms of their learning. In terms of kind of embedding that learning, another big trend we see is the corporate university. So you can see what's happening is a lot of organizations like BHP, Maxis, Telkomsel are setting up these corporate universities inside, partnering with universities, etc., to create that curriculum over 2 to 3 years to train their staff, which then ultimately become feeder to the talent within the company itself. So the question is, how can universities and corporates kind of to work together in order to provide that lifelong learning? New entrants, as you can see. So it might not be traditional universities providing all the answers in education. It might be a lot of different providers and a lot of different partnerships doing that. The middle part is then what and how is happening in the learning environment. And you can see the curriculum creation talks about the micro-learning and the micro-credentials, which we touched on in some of the other presentations. And the one I would like to point out is kind of the movement into catering to your audience via geographies and demographics, because what we've seen in working with the different universities, and particularly international business schools, is that they're very much segmenting the geography to play to that language. So not just taught in English, but different language. So you can, so it's not just Western kind of methodology, it's a little bit of both. Secondly, what we've seen a lot of trend is in curriculum matched to, say, for example, general management education in China or in Indonesia, which is a very different kind of, it would be a very different way of what constitutes success in those types of countries. And then you can see the curriculum delivery, something that we've talked much about, but the one that I'd like to kind of point out is then the smart learning management system, so the LMS. And that's kind of a place where we're looking to unlock a lot of the benefits, because the personalization of the content and I guess when you do your tests and when you talk to your community, when you're doing your cases, etc., it's where do you go from there? Much like a GMAT, for instance, when you go to business schools, it progressively either gets harder or less harder or points you to a different direction depending on your own individual learning needs. So kind of using that. And then finally, it's how do you create the hook for the lifelong learning? So we all know lifelong learning is very important, but how do you actually get people to complete the course? So that conversion rate. And one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot, particularly from a business school perspective, is how do you connect the community together of the community of learners, not just by the digital infrastructure you have, but creating that learning where you can connect with other people in the community to continue that conversation outside the classroom. So this is just a little bit more of an example of what we're seeing, because, and I think we've touched each of these, so I won't labor on these points, but the bite-sized mobile-friendly content, as you can see, anytime access, so you can see a lot of access on mobile phones, tablets, etc., anywhere you go. Personalized delivery, so this is the concept around experiential learning, where it's about how do you do, say, for a business school, case studies where everyone is around the world, but you want to have that rich discussion to replicate what happens in the classroom. So that's that storytelling aspect and also case-based aspect, which the business schools are kind of experimenting with. And then obviously live podcasts where you can connect in around the world. And so, for example, for that segment of global education, particularly in executive education, that's really important for them to have that connection, which kind of brings me to this, because this is a bit of a thinking of how institutions and universities, etc., are thinking of what the future looks like from a consumer or participant perspective, because each of these segments have different learning needs, as we've discussed some of those today, from senior executives, which they might, if you look at this spectrum, folk like more face-to-face kind of general management, they're more senior in the organization, they have less time, but they want a combination of synchronous and asynchronous. But as you go down to specialists or executives, they might be the managerial levels, which they're okay to have a lot more online modules, et cetera, to do within their own time, and they need less of that face-to-face with that kind of C-suite cohort. So that's how the thinking is evolving in those places. Now, getting to this topic that we're talking about now, which is what's prohibiting some of these aspects of change, because you can see, like in America, a lot of the partnerships with the MOOCs, for instance, so the Harvard X, the MIT X's, et cetera, they're kind of aimed at the individuals, creating an online course marketplace, but they do that with some of the edtech companies. So that one is providing the platform and one is providing the content. And that's how they go to market. In another case, and as we can see more in the European and Asian market, is segmenting and targeting the corporate market. And they've been doing that quite successfully as opposed to MOOC tie-ups. And so they're doing a lot of standalone propositions with either corporations, consultancies, in a sales-led and strategic partnership. And some big examples of that is INSEAD with Microsoft and Accenture in very tailored curriculum and tailored content, which is designed over a year period to advance their executives so they can speak a common language. For example, the Accenture one was how do we train everyone in strategy and speak the same language in strategy, and also digital transformations and big organization transformations. The final point that I'll leave with it is then, I've gone through a lot of transformations in Australia and then also Asia, working with large institutions. The barriers to going digital, and some of the speakers have spoken about these issues, but one is kind of understanding that that in universities you have now a new breed of kind of customers coming through that demand different things, which we've kind of talked about. And then the key thing that's inhibiting is just getting that senior top-down management to commit to that investment required to the change, which is hard. And often the case, it takes a long time to do that during the change. Even if you have a large-scale change program, there is often a big divide between the faculty side and the operations side. And one of the key things is to merge the thinking of the two at least, and at least get them in the same room for like in the first place to have those discussions. The second aspect is the IT legacy infrastructure. Usually we see in universities, those problems are given to the IT department, not actually the business side or the faculty that are facing the students. So there is a little bit of disconnect or silos between IT and the business side. And therefore you see a lot of the legacy technology kind of harboring the information, but you can't really use it for the data analytics or use it for the platform for learning. That's the second aspect. And then the third one is then the culture inhibiting the rapid development of it. And we've talked about that today, that fear of technology, not knowing how to do it and not having those champions of change. And so what are some of these ways to mitigate the barriers, or something to think about, which is a lot of universities don't define that overall where are we going piece first, like the strategic aspect of it at the highest level. And it might sound easy, but it's kind of, this is the hard part, which is just sitting down with that group and defining where do we want to go in as an organization. And to give a case, like a lot of the business schools are now only getting to that position where they're going, okay, we're under a lot of pressure now for face-to-face business school, our enrollments are declining to a degree. Is there another market out there online that we can provide education in? Let's become more structured around that conversation and really invest in that area. And that's only really happening now, even though we've been talking about online for a long, long time. So having that coherent vision, because if you don't, then each of the faculties, departments, et cetera, at large-scale universities will do their own thing and have very segmented, piecemeal transformation change. The second aspect then is understand that digital transformation is not just IT departments, so cross departments. So that's kind of linked to the first point. And then the third one is just investing in that community in digital. So it's not just the role of one, it's having everyone and the peer group to support that digital change that's behind it. Often where we see the transformation fall down is the kind of senior management not being behind the overarching message or behind the change. And that's kind of the first thing that's hard, because that's the top-down message that has to come first. And then you build bottom-up in the implementation of that change over time. And that happens quite long. So the other projects I've been part of in Australia and here, it's often taken 3, 4, 5 years to get to a certain position, kind of changing both the front, kind of middle and back end, and to explore new markets. So that's what I wanted to end on for this. So thank you very much.